The vast, misty plains near Santa Fe stretched endlessly before Ben, a canvas of muted greens and browns under a sky heavy with the promise of rain. It was a cloudy morning, the kind that whispered of secrets held deep within the rugged landscape, muffling sounds and blurring horizons. Ben, a man etched by solitude and the relentless sun, rode his gray Mustang, silver, with an practiced ease that spoke of countless miles traversed. Silver, a magnificent animal whose coat shimmered like moonlight on a still pond, moved with quiet power, his hooves kicking up small puffs of dust that vanished into the damp air. Their journey was a familiar ritual, a silent communion, a routine tranquility that had defined Ben's existence for years. But today, that rhythm was abruptly shattered. From the window of a distant, isolated house, barely a speck on the horizon, a faint, rhythmic flash caught Ben's eye. It was an improbable sight, a tiny beacon struggling valiantly against the immense expanse, yet undeniably present. 1, 2, 3. A distinct pause, then 3, 2, 1 again. Morse code. SOS. Ben blinked, wondering if the swirling mist was playing tricks on his vision, or if the profound isolation was unraveling his mind. A signal? Out here? It seemed utterly impossible, a desperate cry from a place where such cries were rarely, if ever, heard. Before Ben could even fully process the anomaly, Silver reacted. The Mustang, usually so steady and predictable on their well-worn trails, snorted, his ears swiveling sharply towards the distant, flickering light. Then, without any command, he quickened his pace, veering sharply off the known trail. His powerful muscles bunched as he broke into a determined canter, his body language radiating an unmistakable resolve. Silver was guiding them directly towards the house, his urgency uncanny, almost prophetic. Ben tightened his grip on the reins, his initial surprise quickly morphing into a cold knot of dread deep in his stomach. Silver's instincts were rarely wrong, a truth forged over years of shared survival, and the horse's unwavering focus now became an undeniable, chilling premonition. Something was profoundly, terribly wrong at that isolated dwelling, and Silver knew it. From afar, the house appeared deceptively normal, a simple, weather-beaten structure, its faded paint blending seamlessly into the muted tones of the surrounding land. No obvious signs of turmoil, no smoke, no vehicles. Yet, Silver's agitated movements, the way his head tossed with nervous energy, the insistent forward pull that almost lifted Ben from the saddle, and that persistent, desperate signal painted a vivid, unsettling picture of unseen peril. Ben felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine, a strange, undeniable sense of obligation settling heavily on his shoulders, an unfamiliar weight in his solitary life. He recognized the gravity of that silent plea, a desperate call echoing across the vast, indifferent miles, finding an unexpected receiver in him and his intuitive horse, a silent vow forming in his heart. His hand instinctively went to the worn leather of his holster, the familiar, comforting weight, a small measure of reassurance against the burgeoning unknown. He prepared himself for whatever awaited them, his senses heightened, his mind racing through myriad possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. The vastness of the plains, usually a source of profound peace, now felt like an ominous accomplice to whatever hidden trouble lay ahead, shrouding the house in an almost sinister silence, intensifying the isolation. A quiet, unsettling realization dawned on him as Silver pressed on, unwavering in his new, urgent direction. An unspoken plea had just met an unexpected savior, guided by the purest of instincts, an instinct that transcended mere animal intelligence, reaching into the very core of human need and compassion. The mystery of the SOS deepened with every powerful hoofbeat, the full extent of the danger still unrevealed, but palpable in the heavy, humid air that clung to the land. Ben leaned forward, his gaze fixed intently on the distant, silent house. A silent promise forming in his heart, a commitment he hadn't sought but couldn't now deny. They were coming. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Ben, etched by the unforgiving sun and whispering winds of the New Mexico plains, carried the vastness of the land within him. His life was a testament to quiet solitude, a deliberate choice forged in the crucible of past heartbreaks. A seasoned cowboy, his hands calloused from years of tending fences and coaxing life from arid soil, his eyes held the distant gaze of one observing horizons more than faces. The plains were his canvas, a sprawling masterpiece of ochre and sage, beautiful in their raw indifference, yet demanding an independent spirit from all who sought to call them home. It was this very landscape that had sculpted his character, making him resilient, self-reliant, and profoundly isolated. His days unfolded with a predictable rhythm, a comforting cadence that kept the world at bay. Mornings began before dawn, the scent of strong coffee mingling with the crisp desert air. He'd tend his small ranch, weathered wood and sun-baked earth, before saddling Silver and riding the range. These solitary patrols were more than just work. They were a communion, a moving meditation, where the thud of hooves against dust became a heartbeat. In the vast, silent stretches between distant mesas, Ben found a solace that human company rarely afforded. It was a life of simple truths, where the needs of the land and his animals dictated his purpose, leaving little room for the complexities of human emotion. Yet, beneath that guarded exterior lay a vulnerability, a tender spot scarred by a loss he rarely acknowledged. A disappointment, perhaps a love lost or trust betrayed, had steered him towards this solitary path, convincing him to avoid deep connection. He was not hardened, not entirely, but rather carefully preserved, like an ancient artifact protected from further erosion. A quiet yearning for purpose beyond survival flickered, a subtle desire for connection he consistently pushed down, dismissing it as weakness in a world valuing strength. He dreamt of a life less solitary, a quieter joy, but never dared to voice it, even to himself. His profound bond with Silver transcended mere ownership. The Mustang was more than a horse, a trusted confidant, a silent partner understanding Ben with uncanny depth. Silver's intuition was almost prophetic, his senses often picking up on things long before Ben's human perception could register them. In Silver's steady presence, Ben found a reflection of his own spirit, a wild freedom tempered by loyalty. The horse was an extension of Ben's very soul, a connection that spoke volumes without a single word. The people of rural New Mexico, much like Ben, held a deep reverence for self-reliance. It was a cultural cornerstone, a legacy passed down through generations of pioneers who tamed this harsh land. Neighbors were always there in a true emergency, but generally, one handled one's own affairs. This independent spirit, while admirable, inadvertently led to overlooked situations, to quiet struggles mistaken for privacy rather than profound need. The social climate, valuing personal fortitude, sometimes fostered isolation devastating for those who struggled, making pleas for help hard to hear, let alone act upon. It was a landscape where people often disappeared into their own lives, sometimes until it was too late. This intricate tapestry of Ben's life, his solitude, past wounds, unspoken yearnings, and extraordinary connection with Silver, established him as uniquely attuned to the silent suffering of others. He understood the language of isolation better than most, making him the improbable, yet perfect recipient of an SOS flashed from a distant window, guided not by human decree, but by the purest, most ancient instinct of his horse. The signal, faint as it was, cut through the layers of his self-imposed detachment, hinting at a desperate need that resonated with the quiet, unacknowledged depths of his own soul. He was a man who knew what it felt like to be alone, and perhaps because of that, he was destined to answer the call of another. The isolated dwelling, now a beacon of desperate light against the vast New Mexico morning, held a story far older than Ben's initial sighting. It was a tale etched not in stone, but in the slow, agonizing erosion of connections, a silent retreat from the world that few had noticed, and fewer still had truly understood. For years, the family inhabiting that modest structure, a mother and her young daughter, had been a quiet fixture on the periphery of the sparse community. They were known for their fierce independence, a trait common in these parts, but one that had, tragically, become a double-edged sword. Whispers had circulated, not malicious, but laced with the detached concern that often accompanies distance. A prolonged illness, they said, had taken root within the mother, a relentless malady that slowly sapped her strength, and with it, their limited resources. Financial struggles followed, like hungry shadows, forcing them deeper into their self-imposed solitude. The once tidy yard, a small patch of green against the ochre earth, had gradually surrendered to weeds and neglect. A broken fence post here, a shutter hanging askew there. These were the subtle signs, dismissed by the occasional passer-by as merely the ravages of time or the natural weariness of a rancher's life. People were busy with their own hardships, their own battles against the unforgiving land, and the quietness emanating from the house was often mistaken for a desire for privacy, not a cry for help. The community, bound by an unspoken promise to look out for its own, had inadvertently failed. Their independent spirit, which usually ensured resilience, had in this instance allowed a vital thread of connection to fray and snap. They had seen the family withdraw, but had attributed it to a stoic acceptance of their fate rather than a desperate struggle against it. This oversight was not born of malice, but of the vastness of the land and the ingrained respect for personal space that often defined these isolated lives. For the little girl inside, whose name was Lily, the isolation had been a slow, suffocating descent. She had watched her mother weaken, her world shrink to the four walls of their home, and the immense burden of survival fall onto her impossibly small shoulders. The simple acts of daily life, cooking, cleaning, caring for her ailing parent, became monumental tasks, far beyond her years. Each day brought a new humiliation, a fresh wave of helplessness, as she grappled with situations that no child should ever face. The lack of food, the growing disarray, the fear that gnawed at her constantly. These were the silent manipulators of her young life, twisting her reality into something unrecognizable. Her profound sense of loneliness deepened with every passing month, every unanswered question, every night spent listening to her mother's labored breathing. The SOS Ben had witnessed was not a sudden, impulsive act, but the culmination of months, perhaps even years, of silent suffering. It was the final, desperate gesture of a child pushed to the absolute brink, her small hand reaching out for salvation in the only way she knew how. The light she flashed was not merely a signal. It was the last flicker of hope from a soul suffocating under the weight of an unacknowledged crisis, an inevitable climax to a slow, burning tragedy that had unfolded in plain sight, yet remained unseen. The emotional cracks in their world had deepened, widened, and finally, catastrophically, given way. The rhythmic thud of Silver's hooves, once a comforting lullaby against the vastness, now felt like a drumbeat of escalating urgency as they finally closed the distance to the isolated house. What had appeared deceptively normal from afar now revealed its true, sorrowful visage. The property was a testament to long-standing neglect, a stark contrast to the hardy, well-kept ranches Ben was accustomed to seeing. Overgrown weeds, tall and defiant, choked what was once a small garden, their thorny tendrils reaching towards a porch with peeling paint. A section of the wire fence lay crumpled on the ground, a silent admission of defeat, and a broken window pane, patched haphazardly with cardboard, stared out like a sightless eye. The general air of disrepair spoke volumes, each detail a quiet scream of a household in crisis, a visual echo of the SOS signal that had drawn him here. Ben's stomach tightened, a familiar knot of dread twisting within him. His past, a landscape scarred by personal loss and the subsequent embrace of solitude, urged him to rein Silver in, to turn and ride away. This was not his fight. This was an entanglement, a thread pulling him back into the messy, painful fabric of human connection he had so carefully unraveled himself from. He was a cowboy of the plains, a solitary figure, not a harbinger of intervention. His instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, screamed for retreat, for the comfortable anonymity of the open range. But Silver, his magnificent gray Mustang, remained unwavering. The horse stood firm, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring slightly, an equine sentinel rooted to the spot, his silent insistence a powerful counter-argument to Ben's internal demons. The image of the little girl's desperate rhythmic flashes burned in Ben's mind, a tiny beacon of hope and terror that he could not, would not, ignore. Silver's intuition, he knew, was rarely wrong. An oppressive silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind through the eaves and the rustle of dry leaves. There were no sounds of children playing, no clatter of daily chores, no welcoming signs of life. Just the wind, a lonely lament that amplified the sense of desolation and abandonment. Ben dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, each step towards the door a conscious battle against his own reluctance. His hand instinctively went to the worn leather of his revolver, not in anticipation of immediate violence, but as a reflex, a comfort against the unknown horrors he feared might lie within. He felt a growing apprehension, a prickling sensation on his skin that warned him he was walking into a situation far more profound than a simple neighborly check-in. The unseen danger inside seemed to take on a palpable form, a heavy cloak draped over the house. The air grew thick with the unspoken suffering, the immediate threat of a medical emergency or profound neglect becoming almost a physical presence. Ben imagined the judgment of neighbors or relatives, their whispers of, "Why didn't anyone notice?" or Why didn't they do something? He felt a sudden, crushing weight, the burden of his own intrusion mingling with the collective failure of a community. How could such a desperate situation unfold, hidden in plain sight, in a land where people prided themselves on their vigilance? The question hung unanswered, a silent accusation against the vastness and the human tendency to look away. This was the moment of maximum emotional suffocation for Ben. He felt the full, crushing weight of Lily's isolation, a profound empathy for a child forced to shoulder an impossible burden. His own responsibility to act, despite his deep-seated reluctance to engage deeply with anyone's pain, became an undeniable force. He stood before the decaying door, poised on the precipice of a decision that would forever alter his solitary existence. Then, from within the house, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached him. A soft, strained cough, followed by a barely audible whimper. It was enough. It was the final push, the undeniable confirmation that whatever lay beyond that door required immediate intervention. His last hesitations evaporated like mist under the morning sun. The time for observation was over. The time for action had arrived. Ben's hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before he pushed the warped wooden door inward. It groaned on rusty hinges, revealing an interior steeped in a silence far heavier than the quiet of the plains. The air inside was thick and stagnant, a cloying mix of dust, stale food, and the unmistakable metallic tang of illness. Weak shafts of sunlight, struggling through grimy, cobweb-draped windows, illuminated motes of dust dancing in the oppressive gloom, painting a picture of profound neglect. The main room, once perhaps a cozy living space, was now a landscape of disarray. Overturned chairs, blankets haphazardly strewn, and a faint, acrid smell emanating from a corner. There was no sound, only the distant, mournful sigh of the wind outside, and a faint, shallow breathing that drew Ben deeper into the house. He found Lily first, a small, spectral figure huddled in the deep shadow of an old armchair, her knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes, enormous and shadowed in her gaunt face, reflected a raw, primal fear. Yet within their depths, a fragile spark of desperate hope flickered upon seeing him. Her clothes, once probably her mother's, hung loosely on her emaciated frame, and her once golden hair was matted and dull. She didn't move, barely seemed to breathe, a silent testament to the prolonged ordeal she had endured. Following the faint, ragged gasps, Ben moved cautiously towards a small, dim bedroom. There, on a makeshift bed of blankets and worn sheets, lay her mother. Her face was a shocking mask of pallor, drawn tight over sharp cheekbones, her lips cracked and dry. She was a skeletal figure, barely clinging to life, her chest rising and falling with agonizing effort. It was immediately clear she had been gravely ill for an extended period, likely unconscious or barely lucid for days, perhaps even longer. The sight struck Ben like a physical blow, a brutal force that shattered the carefully constructed walls around his heart. The raw desolation, the profound, helpless suffering of both mother and child, ripped through his guarded composure, tearing open old wounds he thought long healed. He saw not just their immediate pain, but the echoes of his own past losses, the profound helplessness he once felt in the face of insurmountable tragedy. This was not a situation he could simply report from a distance, and then ride away, retreating back to his solitary world. Silver's unerring instinct, Lily's desperate, silent signal, his own improbable journey to this remote dwelling. It all culminated in this agonizing moment. He knelt beside Lily, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder, offering a silent, reassuring presence. Her small body trembled under his touch. He then moved to the mother, his limited but practical first aid knowledge, confirming the dire, urgent need for immediate medical intervention. Her pulse was thready, her skin cold. There was no time to lose. Pulling out his satellite phone, a piece of technology usually reserved for the rare, true emergencies of the high plains, Ben's hands, typically steady and sure, trembled slightly as he punched in the emergency number for the nearest small town. The connection crackled, a fragile link across the vast, empty miles. Then a somewhat sleepy, disoriented voice answered, unaccustomed to calls from such remote coordinates. Ben, his voice gruff with urgency but unwavering in its resolve, explained the situation with stark, unvarnished detail. He described the mother's critical, life-threatening condition, the neglected child, the overwhelming isolation that had become their prison. As he spoke, he could almost hear the gears turning on the other end, the sudden dawning realization of the profound oversight, the horrifying truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The stark reality, undeniable and deeply shaming, was laid bare. A family had been suffering, completely unseen, unheard. For far too long, their silent cries swallowed by the vastness of the land and the blind spots of a community. The call wasn't just a desperate request for help. It was an accidental, yet potent, indictment of the silence. A testament to how easily lives could unravel beyond the community's collective, watchful eye. This pivotal moment marked a profound, irreversible shift for Ben. For years, he had deliberately maintained a safe distance, carefully protecting himself from the pain of human connection, from the entanglement and responsibility that came with truly caring for another. But now, confronted with such raw, undeniable vulnerability, his carefully constructed detachment crumbled into dust. He was no longer just an observer, a solitary rider passing through. He was an active participant, a crucial lifeline. He had, without consciously choosing it until this very second, chosen connection, responsibility, and empathy over the comfortable, albeit lonely, solitude he had so meticulously built for himself. The decision was made. There was no turning back. The narrative had irrevocably shifted from a story of a silent plea to one of direct, urgent intervention, signaling the beginning of the end for Lily's prolonged, harrowing suffering and Ben's reluctant, yet necessary, re-engagement with a world he had long tried to keep at arm's length. The urgent, hushed words Ben had spoken into the phone, vibrating with a raw intensity that belied his usual stoicism, had set in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably shatter the quiet desolation of the isolated house. It wasn't long before the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the vast open plains, a stark, piercing sound that grew steadily louder, closer, until it dominated the air, breaking the long, oppressive silence that had been Lily's constant companion. Dust plumed behind the approaching vehicles. An ambulance followed closely by a sheriff's cruiser. As they raced towards the small, neglected dwelling, their flashing lights painting the landscape in urgent, pulsating hues of red and blue. Lily, her small frame trembling with a mix of profound relief and an almost paralytic fear, instinctively moved closer to Ben, her tiny hand clutching the fabric of his worn shirt, as if he were the only anchor in a suddenly chaotic world. The trauma of her ordeal, the months of silent suffering, now clashed with the overwhelming reality of intervention, threatening to overwhelm her fragile composure. She buried her face against his side, finding a momentary sanctuary in the unexpected warmth and solidity of the cowboy who had answered her desperate, silent plea. Silver, sensing the heightened emotions, nudged her gently with his muzzle, a soft wicker of reassurance escaping his lips. Ben, too, was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. A wave of immense relief washed over him, knowing that professional help was finally arriving for Lily and her mother. Yet, it was quickly followed by a profound exhaustion, the adrenaline that had propelled him now receding, leaving him feeling hollowed out. A simmering anger began to churn within him, anger at the situation itself, at the cruel hand fate had dealt this family, and perhaps a deeper, more unsettling anger at the community's collective blindness. But beneath it all, a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years had reopened. Old wounds within his own heart, long buried, now throbbing with a disquieting ache, reflected in the girl's wide, haunted eyes. The local sheriff, a burly man named Brody, with a weathered face and a gaze that missed nothing, was the first to emerge from his cruiser. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the scene. Ben, a lone cowboy, standing protectively over a terrified child, with an incapacitated woman inside the house. Brody knew Ben by reputation, a quiet, solitary man, but protocol dictated suspicion until the full story unfolded. His initial questions were clipped, probing, assessing the situation and Ben's unexpected presence. Soon other vehicles appeared, not emergency services, but the cars of curious neighbors and distant relatives, their occupants drawn by the unusual commotion in such a remote area. Their reactions were a tapestry of human emotion. Some expressed genuine shock, their hands flying to their mouths, murmuring about how they never knew or should have checked in. Others carried a visible weight of shame, their gazes dropping, acknowledging their inadvertent oversight. A few, however, wore expressions of skepticism or even thinly veiled judgment, whispering about those folks keeping to themselves or what went wrong in that house. The cultural dynamics of the region were on full display. The strong, independent spirit that fostered self-reliance also, at times, created a barrier to intervention, a deep respect for privacy that could inadvertently become a shroud for suffering. While some rushed forward to offer immediate, practical aid, others preferred to stand back, their whispers weaving a narrative of gossip and blame, subtly shifting responsibility. Medical personnel, efficient and focused, quickly took charge, their movements a blur of practiced urgency as they tended to Lily's mother, carefully bringing her out on a stretcher. A kind-faced paramedic knelt beside Lily, offering gentle words and a warm blanket, while another assessed her own physical state. Ben watched, a silent sentinel, feeling the invisible lines of his isolation blurring, then dissolving entirely. He found an unexpected ally in Sheriff Brody, whose initial suspicion slowly gave way to a grudging respect as Ben calmly recounted the sequence of events, his honesty undeniable. Brody, a man of the land himself, recognized the sincerity in Ben's eyes, the quiet compassion that had driven him to act. But Ben also felt the silent resentment from those who preferred to maintain the status quo, those who saw his intervention as an unwelcome spotlight on their collective failures. For Lily, this marked the true beginning of her journey toward recovery, a long and arduous path that would involve not just physical healing, but the slow, meticulous mending of a profoundly traumatized spirit. For Ben, the experience was equally transformative. He began to process the emotional weight of his unexpected heroics, confronting his own past in the stark, painful reflection of Lily's present. The walls he had carefully built around his heart, designed to protect him from pain, had been irrevocably breached, allowing both the agony of empathy and the surprising warmth of connection to flood in. The days that followed Ben's intervention were a whirlwind of activity, a stark contrast to the desolate quiet that had previously enveloped Lily's home. Her mother, whose name was Sarah, was stabilized at the nearest hospital, her recovery a slow, arduous climb from the brink. The medical staff confirmed severe dehydration and a virulent infection, conditions that would have been fatal without Ben's swift action. Lily, though physically weak and emotionally scarred, found a fragile stability in the presence of the kind paramedic and, surprisingly, in the quiet, reassuring shadow of Ben. Her small hand, still trembling, often reached for his, a silent plea for the security she had been denied for so long. As Sarah slowly regained strength, the wider consequences of the crisis began to ripple through the community. The resolution of the immediate danger had been achieved, but its wider impact was just beginning to unfold. The antagonist in this story was not a single villain, but the collective oversight, the ingrained habit of privacy, and the subtle indifference that had allowed a family to suffer in silence. The incident became a harsh, undeniable mirror, reflecting the community's failings. Town meetings were called, initially tense and full of defensive murmurs, but slowly giving way to a shared sense of responsibility. New initiatives began to emerge, a volunteer network for checking on isolated residents, a revitalized community outreach program, and a renewed sense of vigilance, a promise that no one would be allowed to slip through the cracks again. The vast, beautiful, yet unforgiving landscape now seemed to demand not just self-reliance, but also communal care. Ben's personal transformation was profound. The walls he had built around his heart, designed to protect him from past pain and loss, had indeed been irrevocably breached. He found his emotional closure not in forgetting, but in embracing a new purpose, one far richer and more meaningful than his previous solitary existence. His loneliness, once a comfortable shroud, was now replaced by genuine connection, a connection forged in crisis and tempered by shared vulnerability. He visited Sarah in the hospital, bringing news of Lily, and saw the gratitude in her weary eyes. He helped Sheriff Brody organize the community response, lending his practical knowledge of the plains and its people. Most significantly, his bond with Lily deepened into something truly special. She had nowhere else to go while her mother recovered, and Ben, without a moment's hesitation, offered his small ranch as a temporary haven. Silver, the intuitive Mustang, seemed to understand, nuzzling Lily gently, a silent guardian. Under Ben's quiet care, Lily began her journey of healing. She helped him feed the horses, learned to identify constellations in the vast night sky, and slowly, painstakingly, began to trust again. Ben became more than a rescuer. He was a mentor, a trusted friend, and in many ways the guardian figure she desperately needed. He taught her resilience, and she, in turn, taught him the unvarnished joy of simple companionship, the quiet strength found in shared moments. The ending was realistic, not a fairy tale. The scars of Lily's ordeal would remain etched into her memory, but they would be scars of survival, not surrender. There was hope, resilience, and a profound sense of human connection that had blossomed from the ashes of neglect. Ben often mused on the power of Silver's uncanny intuition, the unexpected places where true purpose could be found, and the profound importance of seeing beyond one's own solitude. He reflected on how a simple, rhythmic flash of light from a distant window on a cloudy morning had not only transformed a little girl's life, but had irrevocably changed his own. And subtly, irrevocably, it had altered the very fabric of a community, reminding them all that the vastness of the plains should not equate to the vastness of isolation. In the vast, silent plains, a whispered SOS had not just found a savior, but had echoed a truth